It's a Western gun on this Atari archive entry with a look at Outlaw. The old American West might not be the most popular setting in video games, but it has popped up a few times over the years, from Wild Gunman to Sunset Riders up to the recent Red Dead Redemption games. But if you want to see an early example of a video game Western, then Outlaw has you covered. Outlaw was developer David Crane's first game on the VCS, where he would go on to become one of the most prolific game makers on the platform. We're years away from his seminal works like Pitfall, but even this first outing is a solidly replayable two-player game, where two cowboys shoot bullets at each other, competing to see who can hit the other 10 times. The premise isn't original to Crane, however. He was interested in writing a home conversion of Midway's 1975 arcade game, Gunfight. Gunfight itself is noteworthy for being the first twin-stick game, as each player has a stick for moving and another for aiming and firing their gun, and for being one of the very first microprocessor-based video games released, using an Intel 8080. While RCA had developed a microprocessor-based arcade platform based on their 1801 processor design, and had even location tested it earlier in 1975, it never made it to full production. Another company, Mirco, also had a microprocessor-based game out at the same time as Gunfight called PT-109, but it was a major flop. And in fact, Gunfight didn't start out with a microprocessor. The game is something of an officially licensed conversion of Taito's Japanese arcade game Western Gun, released a few months earlier in the year. Western Gun doesn't use a microprocessor at all, and was built using the same logic circuit design every other arcade game before it relied on. There's no programming involved at all. In contemporary interviews and the Gunfight service manual, Midway staff argued that microprocessor-based games would be easier to service since they had fewer parts to deal with. They were also quicker to develop, easier to swap out for other games, and overall were better investments than their logic-based counterparts. Tom McHugh, one of the people who programmed the American version of the game at developer Dave Nutting Associates, has said he didn't even see Western Gun in action before being given the assignment. His boss, Dave Nutting, had simply told him that they were doing the game with a processor. Which brings us back to Outlaw. Crane reduced the controls down to one stick and button, and it works reasonably well. The stick controls your movements. To aim and fire, the player presses and holds the button to stop and get into a firing position, aims using the stick, and then lets go of the button to fire their bullet. Bullets can ricochet around the screen, allowing for more firing angles to hit your target. Crane used a few interesting, albeit not earth-shattering, tricks to make the game work on the VCS. The cowboys and their bullets used the systems allotted to sprites and missiles, while the obstacles in the middle are done entirely using lower-resolution background graphics. These background obstacles are written into the VCS's RAM, which allows them to be manipulated. In some game types, you can shoot bits of them off to allow yourself more firing angles. It's even possible to shoot yourself a big enough opening to walk through to the other side, though since your cowboy doesn't turn around, this can quickly become a terrible risk for no reward. Outlaw's variants are all what you'd expect. There are options for different obstacles in the center of the screen, including a cactus, a moving stagecoach, or a literal wall. Some options limit each player to 6 bullets to hit their opponent, requiring both players to run out before getting a restock. The blow-away game types allow for the aforementioned object-clearing bullets. In other games, they simply stop if they hit something with no consequence. Finally, there are getaway game types that allow players to move immediately after firing rather than waiting for their bullet to disappear. While the game types with all of the limited ammunition, getaway, and moving obstacle options are more interesting to play, they are on the whole unremarkable for a game about two people shooting at each other. In case a second player was unavailable, the game includes a single-player shooting gallery variant. With a bouncing target, the player must try and shoot 10 times within 99 seconds. Finally, the difficulty switches change whether or not a bullet in flight will disappear if the cowboy who fired it is hit. Crane said that over his career he found himself uninterested in adding an array of game types to his titles, as was Atari's house style at the time. He said that he felt that this was leaving too much up to players. Rather, he found himself preferring to make one set of interesting features and leaving it at that. Fortunately, the underlying game to Outlaw is solid. It all comes down to timing and being willing to take measured risks to get your shots in and then move back to safety. The large character sprites and relatively slow walking speeds limit how well you can effectively dodge, but this just means games don't tend to last very long. Midway's Gunfight arcade game was enough of a success that Atari was not the only company looking to bank on it with home versions. RCA's own 1977 release, Gunfighter, is among the very first games written by their programmer Andy Modla for the Studio 2, It apes the basic concept pretty well. Modla had written it as an exercise to see what the hardware was capable of and its limits. What he found was that the system was not well suited to fast-paced action games. Players are limited to only moving up and down, and there's not much in way of options, but the game plays reasonably well and includes a computer opponent. Modla himself said that he didn't remember playing the arcade game prior to writing the game, but doesn't rule out being inspired subconsciously by it. In all, he remembers it taking about 6 weeks to write. More involved are the other two home versions that came along after RCA's game system was dropped. The first is an official home version of Gunfight found on the Bally Professional Arcade as a built-in game. This version is unique in that you use the spinner on the Bally controller to fine-tune your firing angle instead of just pushing up or down to slightly angle your shots like on the Atari version. This could readily be considered the best Gunfight home version of its time. Magnavox had its own version with Showdown in 2100 AD for the Odyssey 2, known simply as Gunfighter in Europe, where players are controlling cowboy robots in a shootout. Despite the odd premise, the game is well animated, though the animation also ends up giving it more of a deliberate pace than its competitors. Bullets can bounce off of trees and other obstacles, though you are limited to firing in a horizontal line. If you run out of bullets, touching the rock that matches your player color will reload your gun. The game even features a computer opponent too if no one touches the second controller. And the VCS itself played host to a fast-paced homebrew rendition of the arcade game called Gunfight in 2001. This version of the game even has a rendition of Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire song for its opening tune, and a computer opponent. Outlaw, released as Gunfighter by Sears, is another mystery release date title, though it has a copyright date for commerce of August 1978. Contemporary thoughts aren't easy to come by, but it did get a small blurb in an issue of Space Gamer, a magazine dedicated primarily to tabletop games, in 1980, wherein the writer said it was fun. Unfortunately, we don't have much information on how Outlaw sold. Atari Corp's internal sales figures indicate that they had sold roughly 7,500 copies of the game between 1986 and 1988, the last year it appears in their data. Not among the most impressive sales figures they had for older titles, but a respectable number. It does also appear in practically all of Atari Inc.'s catalogs through 1983, which does suggest it had strong enough legs to keep it on the market through the VCS's heyday. And anecdotally, it is a fairly common game to find even now, which does indicate, if nothing else, Atari made a whole lot of copies over the years. And really, it isn't hard to see why. Outlaw does a good job in capturing the appeal of early head-to-head VCS games. It's intuitive to learn and play, matches are over fairly quickly, and once you settle onto the variations that work for you, it remains one of the more entertaining titles from the console's first few years. And as for David Crane, we'll be seeing a lot more of his work in the future. Next time, we're capturing the flag in a rather unique VCS title.